Marsha Wilson gripped the steering wheel tightly as if a car wound its way through the streets of her new city. Despite the bright sun casting its rays over the city's skyline, a lingering shadow of unease settled over her heart. Today was supposed to be a momentous occasion, her first day as the chief of police in a department known for its rigid hierarchy and lack of diversity. But instead of feeling triumphant, Marsha felt a sense of apprehension and tension. She knew that being a black woman in a position of authority would come with challenges, especially in a precinct where the culture was deeply rooted in tradition and often resistant to change. As she drove, Marsha's mind wandered back to the journey that had led her here. Raised in a modest neighborhood, she had witnessed her community struggle with the law enforcement system firsthand. She had seen people treated unfairly, judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. That was what drove her to pursue a career in law enforcement, determined to bring about change from within. She worked tirelessly, often the only woman of color in her ranks, facing discrimination and skepticism at every step. But Marsha's resolve was unbreakable. She climbed the ranks, proving herself not only through her dedication, but also by her skill and intelligence. Now, after years of dedication, she had earned this role as the new chief of police. However, her appointment was met with resistance. She had heard whispers of disapproval, even before setting foot in the precinct. Her new city had a reputation for conservative values, and many officers were unhappy about her arrival. Marsha knew that gaining their respect would be an uphill battle, but she was ready. She had spent her entire career challenging biases, breaking down walls, and refusing to let prejudice define her. The precinct building loomed ahead, and she could feel her heartbeat quicken. Today marked a new chapter, not just for her but for the entire department. She knew she would be facing a system that had long been stagnant, where some officers viewed change as a threat rather than an opportunity. But Marsha was not one to back down from a challenge. She had prepared herself to tackle this head-on with courage and grace. As she approached a familiar intersection, she noticed the flashing lights of a police patrol car in her rearview mirror. The red and blue lights spun, filling her car with an eerie glow. Her first thought was that they must be responding to an emergency, but then she realized that the car was right behind her, urging her to pull over. Confused, Marsha signaled and pulled to the side of the road, her heart racing. It was unusual for her to be pulled over, especially since she hadn't violated any traffic rules. Two officers, both white, exited the patrol car and slowly approached her vehicle. Marsha took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She knew the protocol. She had been on both sides of traffic stops countless times. But this time was different. As they drew closer, she could see the expressions on their faces. Stern, almost dismissive. It was a look she had encountered before, a mixture of skepticism and condescension that black people, especially in positions of authority, often faced. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, preparing herself mentally for what was about to unfold. The first officer, a tall man with a grey mustache and a hardened expression, tapped on her window. Marsha rolled it down, maintaining eye contact and a calm demeanor. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone curt. Without a word, Marsha reached into her glove compartment and retrieved the documents. She handed them over, watching as the officer examined them with a scrutinizing gaze. The younger officer, standing a few steps behind, watched her with narrowed eyes, a slight smirk on his face. Marsha could sense that they had already made assumptions about her, likely due to her appearance and the fact that she was driving an expensive car. "Where are you headed?" the younger officer asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. Marsha took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. "I'm on my way to work," she replied evenly. The younger officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a silent understanding passing between them. There was an unmistakable air of superiority in their demeanor, as if they were relishing this opportunity to exercise their authority. "What kind of work do you do?" the older officer pressed, his tone laced with judgment. Marsha paused, contemplating her response. Part of her wanted to reveal her position immediately, to watch their expressions shift when they realized who they were talking to. But she decided against it, choosing to observe how far they would go. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied, her tone measured. The older officer's eyebrows arched in surprise at her response, clearly not used to someone speaking to him with such confidence. He glanced at the younger officer, who looked annoyed by her calmness. "Listen, this area isn't exactly known for being safe for people like you." The younger officer sneered, his words laced with thinly veiled prejudice. "So maybe it would be best if you just told us what you're doing here." Marcia felt a surge of anger rise within her. She had dealt with this kind of treatment her entire life, but it never got easier. The assumption that she didn't belong, that her presence in this neighborhood was suspicious simply because of her race, was a painful reminder of the very biases she had spent her career fighting. But she couldn't let her emotions take control now. She needed to remain composed, to handle this situation with the dignity and restraint she had always prided herself on. "I'm here on official business," she replied, her voice steady. The older officer scoffed, clearly unimpressed. He continued to scrutinize her documents, dragging out the process as if to assert his authority over her. Marcia knew they were trying to intimidate her, to remind her of her place in a system that often sought to silence and control people like her. But what they didn't know was that she was no stranger to this kind of behavior, and she had long since learned how to navigate these situations without losing her composure. Minutes passed, and still, the officers showed no sign of letting her go. They continued to question her, their words increasingly condescending. Marcia could feel her patience wearing thin, but she held on, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. Finally, the older officer handed back her documents, a smug expression on his face. "You're free to go," he said, his tone dismissive. "But next time, try to be a little more respectful when answering our questions. You may find it gets you a lot farther." Marcia took her documents, her face impassive as she looked at the officers. She knew that revealing her position now would leave them shocked and scrambling to explain their behavior. But she also knew that there was a lesson to be learned here, not just for them but for the entire department. She decided to leave them in suspense for now, to let this encounter serve as a reminder that things were changing, whether they liked it or not. "Thank you, officers," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'll be sure to remember that advice." With that, she rolled up her window and pulled back onto the road, leaving the two officers watching her with expressions of confusion and irritation. As she drove away, Marcia felt a renewed sense of determination. This was just the beginning. She knew that her presence in the department would challenge deeply ingrained biases, but she was ready. She had come too far and fought too hard to let a few prejudiced individuals stand in her way. Today was the first of many battles she would face, but Marcia was prepared. She was not just here to change the department, she was here to change the entire culture that allowed such behaviors to persist. And she knew that, with patience, resilience, and unwavering resolve, she could make a difference, not only for herself, but for everyone who would come after her. As Marcia drove the rest of the way to the precinct, her mind replayed the encounter she'd just had. She could still feel the simmering anger in her chest, but there was also a sense of calm determination that had settled within her. She knew that what had just happened would be far from the last time her authority was questioned or her legitimacy challenged. This city, with its entrenched traditions and unspoken codes, wasn't going to welcome her with open arms. But that was exactly why she was here, to break down those barriers and redefine what leadership looked like. The precinct building stood tall and imposing against the blue morning sky. It was a historic structure, its architecture a testament to the city's deep-seated traditions. Marcia had done her research. This was one of the oldest precincts in the region, and its history was as complicated as it was proud. She parked her car in the lot reserved for high-ranking officers, stepping out with an air of confidence that she had perfected over years of dealing with skepticism and prejudice. Today, she would begin to carve her space in this place, but she knew that her every move would be watched, dissected, and judged. As she entered the building, her heels clicking against the polished floor, heads turned. She could feel the weight of every gaze upon her, some curious, others suspicious, and a few openly hostile. The air was thick with unspoken questions, but Marcia kept her head high and her face impassive. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to make a difference. Her first day as the chief of police was about to begin, and she would make sure it was unforgettable. She had barely reached her office when an officer knocked on her open door, glancing inside cautiously before stepping in. He was a middle-aged man, with thinning hair and a well-worn uniform. His badge read Lieutenant Donaldson, and his face held a guarded expression, a blend of curiosity and uncertainty. "Good morning, Chief Wilson," he said, his tone polite but measured. "Welcome to the precinct." Marcia offered a firm handshake, looking him straight in the eye. "Thank you, Lieutenant Donaldson. I'm looking forward to getting to know the team here." He nodded, his eyes briefly darting away. "Well, we're a close-knit group around here. Been through a lot together." "I'm sure you'll fit right in," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Marcia could read between the lines. She understood that her appointment as the new chief hadn't been welcomed by everyone in the precinct, and there were likely those who felt she was an outsider, unworthy of her position. But she had no intention of proving herself to anyone. Her record spoke for itself, and she would let her actions do the talking. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant," she replied, maintaining a professional tone. "I believe a strong team is built on trust and respect, and that's exactly what I hope to cultivate here." Lieutenant Donaldson shifted uncomfortably, not expecting such a direct response. "Right, well, if there's anything you need, I'll be around," he muttered before quickly excusing himself. As he left, Marcia couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. She had hoped that at least some members of her team would be open to her leadership, but it was clear that winning their trust would be a challenge. Nevertheless, she was here to do a job, and she wouldn't let their preconceived notions deter her. She spent the next hour settling into her office, familiarizing herself with the case files stacked on her desk. The precinct was dealing with a number of ongoing investigations, some of which were high-profile cases that had attracted public attention. Marcia knew that her role wasn't just about managing the team. It was about making tough decisions and ensuring justice was served. She was determined to bring a fresh perspective to the precinct, one that emphasized fairness, accountability, and transparency. A knock on her door interrupted her focus, and she looked up to see Officer Thompson, the young officer who had stopped her earlier, standing in the doorway. His face was flushed, and he seemed hesitant to meet her gaze. "Chief Wilson," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I wanted to apologize for earlier. I didn't realize." Marcia put down the file she was reading and looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Officer Thompson, please come in." He stepped inside, fidgeting with his hat, clearly uncomfortable. I didn't know you were the new chief. If I had known." She held up a hand, stopping him. "Officer Thompson, whether you knew who I was or not shouldn't matter. Every citizen deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their title or background. Do you understand that?" He nodded, his face growing even redder. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. I'm sorry for my behavior. It was unprofessional." Marcia regarded him thoughtfully, noting the nervousness in his eyes. "Thank you for the apology, Officer Thompson. I hope you'll take this as a learning opportunity. We all make mistakes, but it's how we respond to them that defines us." He nodded again, relief washing over his face. "Thank you, Chief. I won't forget this." As he left, Marcia allowed herself a small sigh. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't anticipated that it would begin before she even stepped into the precinct. This incident had shown her just how deeply rooted some of the biases were in this department. Changing the culture here would take more than just words. It would require action, consistency, and, most importantly, accountability. Later that day, Marcia held her first official meeting with her team. The room was filled with officers of various ranks, all of whom seemed to be eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. She stood at the front of the room, her gaze sweeping over the assembled officers. She could see the skepticism in their eyes, the quiet challenge that some of them seemed to be issuing with their unspoken stares. But she wasn't intimidated. She had faced tougher crowds before. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice calm but commanding. "As most of you know, I'm Chief Marsha Wilson. I understand that my appointment may have come as a surprise to some of you, but I want you to know that I am here to serve this precinct and this community with integrity and fairness." A few murmurs rippled through the room, but Marsha continued, undeterred. "I believe in accountability, and I expect every officer in this precinct to uphold the highest standards of professionalism and respect. Our job is to serve and protect all citizens, without bias or prejudice. That means treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their background or appearance." She could see a few officers shifting uncomfortably, their expressions hinting at reluctance. But Marsha pressed on, her gaze unwavering. "I know that change isn't always easy, but I believe that we can make this precinct a better, more inclusive place for everyone, and I am here to support each of you in that process." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, the officers' expressions ranging from skeptical to thoughtful. Marsha knew that not everyone would be receptive to her message, but she also knew that respect was earned, not given. She was prepared to work hard, to prove through her actions that she was more than capable of leading this precinct. As the meeting came to an end, Marsha dismissed the team, watching as they filed out of the room. Some of the officers avoided her gaze, while others offered polite nods. A few, however, lingered, their expressions thoughtful. Marsha took that as a small victory. Even a single spark of openness was a step in the right direction. Once the room had cleared, Marsha returned to her office, feeling both exhausted and invigorated. The day had been challenging, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. She knew that change would not come overnight, but she was willing to fight for it, day by day. Just as she was about to sit down, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an old friend, someone who had been her mentor during her early days in law enforcement. "How's the first day, Chief?" the message read. Marsha smiled, typing back quickly. "Tough, but exactly what I expected. They won't know what hit them." Her friend's response was immediate. "Proud of you. Keep pushing. They need someone like you, even if they don't realize it yet." Marsha leaned back in her chair, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She was here for a reason, and she wouldn't let anything stand in her way. This was just the beginning, and she was ready to face every challenge that came her way. Her journey was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. And as she looked out the window at the city she had vowed to protect, she felt a sense of calm determination settle over her. No matter the obstacles, Marsha knew she would lead this department into a new era, an era of respect, justice, and equality. She was here to stay, and she was ready to prove to everyone, including herself, that she belonged. The first few weeks in her new position were anything but easy for Marsha Wilson. Each day was filled with challenges, both overt and subtle, and it became clear that some officers were testing her boundaries, waiting to see if she would falter under the weight of their scrutiny. They weren't used to her leadership style, nor to her presence as a black woman in a role that had traditionally been held by white men. But Marsha had expected this. She knew change was never comfortable, especially in a system that had long operated with an unspoken code. One morning, as Marsha was reviewing case reports, Lieutenant Donaldson appeared in her doorway. His expression was stern, a telltale sign that he had something on his mind. Over the past few weeks, she'd come to realize that Donaldson was respected in the precinct, a man who had been around long enough to earn the trust of his peers. She understood that gaining his respect could be pivotal to her success, yet she was aware that he, like many others, had reservations about her leadership. "Good morning, Chief," he said, standing with his hands behind his back. "Do you have a minute to discuss something important?" "Of course, Lieutenant Donaldson," Marsha replied, motioning for him to sit. "What's on your mind?" He took a seat, leaning forward, his brows furrowed. "I'll be direct with you, Chief. Some of the officers are, uncomfortable with the recent changes you've been implementing. The new protocols, the emphasis on community outreach, it's not how things have traditionally been done around here. Marcia nodded, listening intently. I appreciate your honesty, Lieutenant. I understand that change can be difficult, especially when people have grown accustomed to certain practices over time. But these changes are necessary if we want to build trust with the community and uphold the principles of justice that this precinct stands for. Donaldson sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I get that, Chief, but there's a sentiment among the officers that you're trying to fix something that isn't broken. They feel like their way of doing things is being dismissed, and that's causing a lot of resentment. They're questioning why these changes are happening now. Marcia took a deep breath, carefully choosing her words. Lieutenant, I respect the history of this precinct, and I respect the work that's been done here. But there's a difference between tradition and stagnation. Just because something has been done a certain way for years doesn't mean it's the best or only way. I want to lead this department toward a more inclusive and effective approach to policing. That means being willing to adapt and evolve. Donaldson's expression softened slightly, as if he could see the depth of her conviction, but there was still a hint of skepticism in his eyes. Look, Chief, I'll be honest. I've been in this job a long time, and I've seen people come and go. Not everyone here is going to be on board with your vision, no matter how good your intentions are. Marcia met his gaze, unflinching. I'm not asking for everyone's approval, Lieutenant. I'm asking for cooperation and respect. I believe that once the officers see the positive impact of these changes, they'll come around. But until then, I need leaders like you to support this vision, even if it feels uncomfortable. We're not just here to serve ourselves, we're here to serve the community. There was a long pause as Donaldson seemed to weigh her words. Finally, he gave a reluctant nod. I'll do my best, Chief, but you should know that there's already been talk about resisting some of these changes. Marcia's expression hardened. Resisting? What exactly does that mean? He shifted uneasily in his seat. Some of the officers are planning to push back against the new community engagement initiatives. They think it's a waste of time, that it's not real police work. They feel that it's undermining their authority on the streets. Marcia's jaw clenched. She had expected some resistance, but she hadn't anticipated outright defiance. Lieutenant Donaldson, I need you to make it clear to the team that these changes are not optional. I'm open to feedback and discussion, but I will not tolerate insubordination. The community engagement initiatives are critical to building trust, and that's a priority. Donaldson nodded, though his expression remained conflicted. Understood, Chief. I'll relay the message. As he left her office, Marcia leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the conversation settle on her shoulders. She knew that her approach was unorthodox for this precinct, but she firmly believed it was necessary. This was a city that had a history of strained relations between law enforcement and the communities they were meant to protect. She had reviewed the statistics: higher rates of arrests among minority groups, reports of excessive force, and a general lack of trust in the police. Marcia knew that if things didn't change, the situation would only worsen. Later that day, she held a meeting with the precinct's community liaison officers. These were the officers assigned to work closely with the public, fostering relationships and addressing local concerns. Marcia saw this team as a crucial bridge between the precinct and the community, and she was determined to strengthen their role. The meeting room was filled with officers of varying ranks and backgrounds, each one eyeing her with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Marcia began by outlining her vision for community engagement initiatives, emphasizing the importance of transparency, empathy, and active listening. I want every single one of you to understand that our job is not just to enforce the law, but to protect and serve with integrity, she said, her tone firm but passionate. Our goal is to build relationships based on mutual respect. The community needs to know that they can trust us, that we're here to help, not just to police. This means actively listening to their concerns, participating in community events, and making an effort to understand their experiences. One of the officers, a burly man with a hardened expression, raised his hand. Chief Wilson, with all due respect, we're police officers, not social workers. Our job is to maintain order, not hold people's hands. I don't see how attending community events is going to make us any better at our jobs. Marcia looked at him, unflinching. Officer Riley, I understand where you're coming from. But let me ask you this. How effective do you think we can be if the community doesn't trust us? If people are afraid to come to us with their concerns, or if they see us as the enemy, then we're failing in our mission. Building trust is not a distraction from our work, it's an essential part of it. The room fell silent as her words sank in. She could see a few officers nodding thoughtfully, while others appeared unconvinced. But Marcia knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. Her job was to plant the seeds of a new perspective, to challenge their assumptions and open their minds to a different way of thinking. After the meeting, as the officers filed out, one of the younger officers approached her. His name was Officer Diaz, a rookie who had joined the precinct only a few months earlier. He seemed nervous, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. Chief Wilson, he began hesitantly, I just wanted to say that I think what you're doing is inspiring. I joined the force because I wanted to make a difference, and I believe in your vision. I know not everyone is on board, but I want you to know that I'm here to help. Marcia smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. Thank you, Officer Diaz. Your support means a lot. Change is never easy, but it's people like you who make it possible. Keep that passion alive. It's what this precinct needs. He nodded, his expression brightening. I will, Chief. And if there's anything I can do to help with the community outreach, just let me know. Marcia watched him walk away, feeling a glimmer of hope. She knew that for every officer who resisted her vision, there were others who were quietly supportive, waiting for the chance to step forward. These allies, however few they might be, would be instrumental in transforming the culture of the precinct. Over the next few weeks, Marcia focused on implementing her community engagement initiatives. She encouraged officers to attend local events, organize neighborhood patrols that involved positive interactions with residents, and conduct forums where community members could voice their concerns. She even went out herself, attending these events alongside her team, showing them that she wasn't just a distant leader, but someone who was willing to be on the ground, building trust one person at a time. At one event, held at a local community center, Marcia found herself in a room full of residents eager to share their experiences and concerns. She listened attentively as they spoke, each story a reminder of the challenges they faced. Some residents spoke of feeling targeted by law enforcement, while others expressed fear and frustration at the lack of transparency in the department's operations. One elderly woman, Mrs. Johnson, approached Marcia after the forum ended. Her eyes were filled with sadness, but there was also a glimmer of hope. Chief Wilson, she said, her voice trembling, I lost my grandson last year. He was only 19. He was arrested and things didn't go right. I just want to know that something is being done, that his life wasn't lost in vain. Marcia took the woman's hands, looking her straight in the eye. Mrs. Johnson, I'm so sorry for your loss. I can't begin to understand the pain you're going through. But I want you to know that I'm here to make sure that the system changes so that no other family has to endure what you've been through. I'm committed to justice, and I won't stop until we see real change. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes, and she nodded, squeezing Marcia's hands. Thank you, Chief. We need someone like you. As Marcia left the community center that night, she felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. The stories she'd heard, the pain and frustration of the residents, they were reminders of why she had taken this job in the first place. She was here to make a difference, to fight for those who felt voiceless and unseen. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but as she looked up at the stars shining brightly above, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. For Marcia, this was more than just a job. It was a calling, a chance to right the wrongs of a system that had left too many behind. And she was prepared to give it everything she had, no matter the obstacles. Weeks turned into months, and Marcia continued to face resistance within her department. Each new policy she introduced was met with grumbles of discontent, thinly veiled sarcasm, and in some cases, outright defiance. She had become a symbol of change, something that many of the officers in her precinct neither wanted nor welcomed. They saw her not as a leader trying to uplift the community and the department, but as an outsider attempting to dismantle their traditions. And as her authority continued to be tested, Marcia knew she was headed toward a reckoning with her team. She just didn't know when it would come. That reckoning arrived on an unusually cold morning in November. Marcia had called a department-wide meeting to review the latest community engagement initiatives. She had noticed an alarming trend in the monthly reports. Despite her directives, many officers were still avoiding community outreach efforts. A significant portion of her force was failing to attend the neighborhood events she had painstakingly arranged. Attendance at the public forums was sparse, and even those officers who did participate often stood at the back of the room, disconnected and disengaged. She knew she couldn't let this slide. These officers needed to understand that her directives were not suggestions but orders. If they refused to engage with the community, they were not only undermining her authority, but also failing to fulfill their duty as public servants. As the precinct gathered in the meeting room, Marcia stood at the front, her expression stern. The chatter in the room slowly died down as the officers took their seats, sensing the tension in the air. Lieutenant Donaldson was there, as were Officers Riley, Diaz, and several others who had come to symbolize the two sides of the department, those who supported her vision and those who resented it. Marcia cleared her throat, her gaze sweeping over the room. "Thank you all for being here today. I want to discuss something that's been troubling me over the past few weeks," she began, her tone measured but firm. "I've noticed that many of you are not participating in the community engagement initiatives. We're seeing low attendance at neighborhood events, and there's a distinct lack of involvement in the forums we're holding for the public. This isn't acceptable." Her words hung in the air, met with silence and a few uncomfortable shifts in seats. She knew some of them had been expecting this conversation, but they weren't prepared for the intensity of her gaze or the firmness in her voice. One officer, Riley, the same burly officer who had questioned her during the previous meeting, leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defiantly. His voice was laced with disdain. "With all due respect, Chief, we didn't sign up to be social workers. We're here to enforce the law, not to attend bake sales and talk about people's feelings." A few officers chuckled, nodding in agreement, but Marcia's expression didn't waver. She let the laughter die down before responding, her voice unwavering. "I understand that some of you may feel that community engagement isn't real police work," she said, her tone cutting through the room's tension. "But let me be clear. Building trust within the community is essential to our mission. If the public sees us as adversaries instead of allies, we're failing. And every officer in this precinct has a responsibility to bridge that gap." Riley shook his head, his expression one of barely concealed frustration. "Chief, no offense, but you're coming in here and trying to change everything overnight. This department's been running just fine for years. We don't need to be holding hands with people to do our job." Marcia felt a spark of anger flare within her, but she kept her composure. "Officer Riley, the fact that we've been doing things a certain way for years doesn't mean it's the right way. Look around you. Look at the statistics. Our precinct has one of the highest rates of public complaints and one of the lowest levels of trust in the city. That's not something to be proud of. It's something to fix." She paused, letting her words sink in, then continued. "I'm not here to make friends or to keep everyone comfortable. I'm here to make this precinct better. And if that means challenging traditions and pushing people out of their comfort zones, then that's exactly what I'll do." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on every person present. Some officers avoided her gaze, others glared defiantly, and a few, like Officer Diaz, watched her with quiet admiration. But Riley wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his face twisted in defiance. "And what about us, Chief? What about the officers who put our lives on the line every day? You sit in your office, making policies and telling us how to do our jobs, But you're not the one out there in the field. You don't understand what it's like. Marsha's jaw tightened. She knew this argument well, the notion that leadership was somehow disconnected from the realities of the street, but she wasn't about to let it go unchallenged. Officer Riley, I may not be on patrol every day, but I've spent my entire career on the front lines. I know what it's like to be in dangerous situations, to face hostility and threats. But I also know that being a police officer is about more than just making arrests. It's about serving and protecting all members of the community, not just the ones we feel comfortable around. Her voice rose, filling the room with an intensity that few had seen from her before. If you think that attending a community event or listening to someone's concerns is beneath you, then maybe you're in the wrong profession. Because policing is about service, and if you're not willing to serve this community, then you're not living up to the badge you wear. A tense silence followed her words. Riley looked away, clearly unsettled, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marsha could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. She knew that she was pushing these officers, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths. But she also knew that this was necessary. She had to draw a line in the sand to make it clear that the old way of doing things was no longer acceptable. Finally, Lieutenant Donaldson spoke up, his voice calm but firm. Chief, I think what some of the officers are trying to say is that change takes time. People are set in their ways, and it's not easy to shift the culture overnight. Marsha nodded, appreciating the measured tone in his response. I understand that, Lieutenant. I'm not expecting instant results, but I'm expecting commitment. I need every one of you to buy into this vision, to at least make an effort to meet the community halfway. If we don't have their trust, then we have nothing. And if we're not willing to change, then we're only going to make things worse. She glanced around the room, meeting the gaze of each officer. This isn't just about policy, it's about integrity. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable. And I need every one of you to decide whether you're with me or against me, because there's no middle ground here. The silence stretched, and Marsha could feel the tension lingering in the air, thick and unyielding. She knew that she had drawn a line, that she had issued a challenge to every person in that room. And she also knew that some of them wouldn't rise to meet it. But she couldn't compromise her values or her vision. She had come here to make a difference, and she wasn't going to let resistance stand in her way. After the meeting, a few officers stayed behind to speak with her privately. Some expressed their support, telling her that they believed in her vision and appreciated her commitment to change. Others voiced their concerns more diplomatically, explaining that they were willing to try, even if they were still skeptical. But Riley remained defiant, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. As the room emptied, he approached her, his eyes hard and unyielding. Chief, you're making a mistake, he said, his voice low, but filled with barely restrained frustration. These community initiatives aren't going to change anything. You're wasting our time, and you're alienating the people who've been loyal to this department for years. Marsha met his gaze, unflinching. Officer Riley, if that's how you feel, then you're welcome to request a transfer. But as long as you're under my command, you will follow my directives, and you'll respect the policies I put in place. Is that clear? His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned and walked away, his back stiff with resentment. Marsha watched him go, a mixture of frustration and sadness settling in her chest. She knew that not everyone would support her, and she was prepared for the challenges that would come with enforcing her vision. But it still stung to see such blatant defiance from someone who was supposed to be her teammate. As the precinct returned to its daily routines, Marsha retreated to her office, feeling the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her. She knew that change was never easy, that it often came with a cost. But she also knew that she couldn't afford to waver. This was her mission, her purpose, and she was determined to see it through, no matter the obstacles. That evening, as she walked to her car, Marsha felt a sense of exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. She was fighting battles on multiple fronts, within the precinct, with the community, and even within herself. But as she looked up at the city lights, she reminded herself why she had taken this job in the first place. She thought about Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman who had lost her grandson, and the other community members who had come to her, seeking justice and compassion. She thought about the young officers, like Diaz, who believed in her vision and were willing to fight for a better future. And she thought about all the people who had been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. Marcia took a deep breath, steeling herself for the journey ahead. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and there would be days when she would feel defeated, isolated, and exhausted. But she also knew that she couldn't give up. She was here to make a difference, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. As she climbed into her car, Marcia allowed herself a small smile. Change was coming, slowly but surely, and though the path ahead was fraught with challenges, she was ready to face them one day at a time. For Marcia Wilson, there was no turning back. She was here to break down barriers, to challenge the status quo, and to build a better future for everyone who called this city home. Months had passed since Marcia had taken her stand against the resistance within her precinct. She had made it clear that there would be no tolerance for insubordination, no room for officers unwilling to treat the community with respect. The challenges that had started as whispers had turned into full-fledged obstacles, but Marcia met them head-on, refusing to back down. Each day was a test of her resolve, a constant battle to prove that her vision for this department wasn't just idealism, it was the path forward. But despite her best efforts, cracks were beginning to show. She could sense it in the way certain officers avoided her gaze in the hallways, in the grumbling whispers that quieted whenever she entered a room, and in the thinly veiled contempt in Officer Riley's eyes every time he looked at her. Her authority was still being questioned, and she knew that if something didn't change soon, her vision for a transformed precinct might never come to fruition. One Friday afternoon, as Marcia was preparing to leave for the weekend, her phone buzzed. It was Lieutenant Donaldson. "Chief, we've got a situation. I think you might want to see this yourself," he said, his voice tense. Marcia's heart sank. She knew that tone. It was the same tone she'd used many times in her career when she had to make a difficult call to a superior, alerting them to a problem that couldn't be ignored. "What's going on, Lieutenant?" "There's been a disturbance during a traffic stop. Officer Riley and Officer Thompson were involved. It's complicated." Marcia's instincts kicked in. "Where are they?" "About 5 blocks from here, near the intersection of Melrose and 4th. The situation has drawn a crowd. I thought it might be best if you came down to manage it." Marcia grabbed her coat and headed out, her mind racing. She knew this could be a defining moment, not just for her as chief, but for the entire precinct. She had pushed for change, demanded accountability, and here was an opportunity to put her principles into action or risk losing everything she'd worked for. When she arrived at the scene, a small crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of anger, confusion, and fear. People held up their phones, recording the officers, shouting questions and accusations. Riley and Thompson stood next to a young black man in handcuffs who looked terrified. His face was bruised, and his eyes were filled with a mix of defiance and dread. Marcia made her way through the crowd, ignoring the murmurs and stares directed at her. She could hear snippets of conversation, people questioning the officers' actions, accusing them of excessive force, demanding justice. The situation was teetering on the edge of chaos, and Marcia knew that one wrong move could ignite a firestorm. As she reached Riley, she saw the defiance in his eyes, his posture tense and defensive. Thompson, who looked younger and more uncertain, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between Riley and the crowd. "Chief," Riley greeted her, his tone laced with resentment. "We've got this under control." Marcia glanced at the young man in handcuffs, then back at Riley. "What happened here?" she asked, her tone sharp and unyielding. Riley crossed his arms, his face hardening. "We pulled this guy over for speeding, and he decided to mouth off. Then he resisted when we tried to detain him. We had to use force to get him under control." Marcia turned to the young man, ignoring Riley's attempts to maintain control of the narrative. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The man hesitated, glancing warily at Riley and Thompson before responding. Darren Lewis." "Mr. Lewis, can you tell me what happened?" Darren swallowed, his eyes flickering with a mix of fear and frustration. I didn't do anything wrong. They'd pulled me over, started questioning me, accusing me of things. I tried to tell them I was just heading home from work, but they wouldn't listen. Next thing I know, they're pulling me out of my car, saying I was resisting." His voice shook, but there was a steadiness in his gaze. "I didn't resist, ma'am. I was scared." Marcia took a deep breath, turning back to Riley. "Is this true? Did he resist?" Riley's jaw tightened, and he avoided her gaze. "He was uncooperative, Chief. We did what we had to do." Marcia could see the cracks in his story, the defensive posture he was trying to maintain. She knew this type of encounter all too well, the subtle shift from a routine stop to something far more dangerous, fueled by bias and assumptions. She'd spent her entire career fighting against this very mindset, and now it was staring her in the face, challenging her authority in the most blatant way possible. She looked at the crowd, then back at Riley and Thompson. "Uncuff him," she ordered, her voice firm. Riley's face twisted in disbelief. "Chief, are you serious?" "Uncuff him. Officer Riley," she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Riley hesitated, clearly struggling to hold onto his control, but finally relented. He took the key and unlocked Darren's handcuffs, his face hardening as he did so. The young man rubbed his wrists, his relief palpable, though he still looked shaken. Marcia addressed the crowd, raising her hands to signal for quiet. "Thank you all for your patience. I understand your concerns, and I promise you that this matter will be thoroughly investigated. Our priority is to ensure that all members of our community are treated with respect and dignity." The crowd murmured in response, some nodding in approval, while others watched her with cautious hope. Marcia knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. They needed action, accountability. They needed to see that change was real, not just an empty promise. Once the crowd began to disperse, Marcia turned back to Riley, her expression hard. "I need a full report on my desk by the end of the day. And Officer Riley, we will be reviewing the body camera footage from this incident. If there's anything in that footage that contradicts what you've told me, there will be consequences." Riley's face flushed with anger, but he didn't argue. Marcia could feel the tension radiating from him, the resentment simmering just beneath the surface. She knew that he would never truly accept her leadership, that he would always see her as an outsider trying to dismantle the way he believed. Policing should be done, but she didn't care. Her allegiance was to justice, not to those who refused to evolve. After the scene had cleared, Marcia walked back to her car, feeling a weight pressing down on her. She knew that her decision to release Darren would stir controversy within the department, that officers like Riley would see it as a betrayal of their authority. But she also knew that she had done the right thing. She had looked into Darren's eyes and seen the fear, the pain, the exhaustion of someone who had been judged without cause. Later that evening, Marcia reviewed the body camera footage in her office. The video confirmed her suspicions. Darren had been polite, if a bit nervous, but he hadn't shown any signs of resistance. Riley's actions had escalated the situation, his questions laced with condescension, his tone hostile from the outset. Thompson, though less aggressive, had followed Riley's lead, his own discomfort evident, but his loyalty to his partner overriding his better judgment. Marcia felt a surge of anger as she watched the footage. This was exactly what she had been trying to change, the very behavior that had eroded trust between the community and law enforcement. She knew that this couldn't be brushed under the rug, that ignoring it would only reinforce the idea that officers could act with impunity. The next morning, Marcia called Riley and Thompson into her office. They arrived with guarded expressions, Riley's face set in a defiant scowl, while Thompson looked more subdued, his gaze flickering nervously. "Gentlemen, I've reviewed the body camera footage from yesterday's incident," Marcia began, her tone cold and unyielding. "What I saw was deeply troubling. Officer Riley, your conduct during that traffic stop was unacceptable. You escalated a routine stop into a confrontation, and you used force without justification." Riley's face flushed with anger. "Chief, with all due respect, I was doing my job. That kid was acting suspicious, and Acting suspicious." Marcia cut him off, her voice laced with contempt. "Because he was black. Because he didn't immediately bow to your authority. That's not suspicious. Officer Riley, that's your bias clouding your judgment." Riley opened his mouth to argue, but Marcia held up a hand, silencing him. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that destroys trust within our community. It's the reason why people don't feel safe approaching us, why they see us as a threat rather than as protectors." She turned to Thompson, her expression softening slightly. "Officer Thompson, I could see that you were uncomfortable during that stop. You knew it was wrong, but you chose to follow Riley's lead. I understand that loyalty is important, but you have a responsibility to act in accordance with the law and with basic human decency. If you see something wrong, you speak up. Silence makes you complicit." Thompson swallowed, nodding, his face pale. I'm sorry, Chief. I should have done something." Marcia nodded. "Apologies are a start, Officer Thompson. But this precinct needs more than apologies. We need accountability. Both of you will be placed on suspension while this incident is reviewed. I expect both of you to take this time to reflect on what it means to serve this community." Riley's face twisted with rage, but he didn't argue. He knew that his defiance would only make things worse, that Marcia was no longer willing to tolerate his insubordination. As they left her office, Marcia felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. She knew that her decision would be controversial, that there would be backlash from those within the precinct who saw Riley as a dedicated officer rather than a problem. But she also knew that she couldn't compromise her principles. That evening, as Marcia walked out of the precinct, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had fought for her values, for the vision she had brought to this precinct. It had cost her dearly, in friendships and trust, but she knew it was worth it. She had seen the look in Darren's eyes, the gratitude mingled with disbelief, and she knew that for him and others like him, her fight mattered. The journey was far from over, but Marcia felt more resolute than ever. She was here to reshape this department, to build a precinct that served everyone with integrity and compassion. And as she looked out at the city she had sworn to protect, she knew that she would continue to fight, one case, one conversation, one act of courage at a time. As the weeks passed following the suspension of Officer Riley and Officer Thompson, Marcia's decision rippled through the precinct like a shockwave. Officers who had once stood firmly in Riley's camp began to question their own behavior, wondering if they too were subject to the same scrutiny. Others were more vocal in their dissent, accusing Marcia of undermining the department and pandering to public opinion. Yet, there was a growing number who began to see her in a different light, who recognized that her commitment to justice wasn't just talk, it was action, even when that action was unpopular. For Marcia, these were some of the most challenging days of her career. She had thought that standing up to Riley and enforcing accountability would bring a sense of relief, but instead, it felt like opening an old wound, one that reminded her of every instance of prejudice she faced, every hurdle that had been thrown her way simply because she refused to conform. She spent long nights at the precinct, combing through reports, reviewing officer conduct, and responding to community concerns that seemed to grow by the day. But she wasn't alone. A core group of officers began to rally around her vision, spearheaded by young Officer Dyers. Over the weeks, he had become a steadfast ally, someone who didn't just agree with her values, but actively worked to embody them. He was often the first to volunteer for community events, and was increasingly vocal in defending Marcia's policies to the more skeptical officers. One Thursday evening, after another grueling day, Marcia was preparing to leave when she saw Dyers waiting outside her office, his face set in a determined expression. "Chief, can I have a word?" he asked, shifting nervously. Marcia nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Of course, Diaz, what's on your mind?" He took a seat, exhaling deeply before he spoke. "I wanted to talk to you about something I've been noticing around the precinct. There's still a lot of tension, a lot of resentment, and some of the officers, well, they're spreading rumors. They're saying you're trying to ruin the department's reputation. They're blaming you for the changes, for the increased scrutiny, for Riley and Thompson's suspension." Marcia nodded, her expression unreadable. She had expected this. She knew that by holding Riley accountable, she'd be challenging the old guard, and they were bound to push back. But hearing it confirmed out loud, from someone she trusted, made it feel all the more real. "Thank you for letting me know, Diaz. I'm aware that there are officers who aren't happy with the changes, but I need you to understand something. I'm not here to be popular. I'm here to make this precinct a better place. If that means facing criticism, so be it." Diaz looked down, nodding slowly. "I get that, Chief, I really do. And I believe in what you're trying to do. It's tough to watch, you know. I see the way they look at you, the way they talk when they think you're not listening. I don't think they understand what you're trying to accomplish." Marcia leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Diaz, I knew this wouldn't be easy. When you're trying to change something as deeply ingrained as the culture in a precinct like this, you're bound to meet resistance. But I appreciate officers like you who see the bigger picture and are willing to fight for it. That means more to me than you know." He looked up, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "Thank you, Chief. That really means a lot. I just want to help however I can." Marcia nodded, feeling a swell of pride. "You already are, Diaz. Just by showing up, just by doing your job with integrity and empathy, you're helping more than you realize." As Diaz left her office, Marcia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that change didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, often painful process, one that required persistence and courage. And she was starting to see that her efforts were taking root, however small those roots might be. The next few days brought an unexpected development. News of Riley and Thompson's suspension had spread beyond the precinct, catching the attention of the media. Local news outlets began reporting on Marcia's efforts to reform the department, framing her as a principled leader fighting to hold her officers accountable. Some reports were favorable, painting her as a hero striving for justice in the face of opposition. Others were more critical, questioning whether her approach was causing unnecessary division within the department. One evening, Marcia received an invitation to participate in a televised panel discussion on police reform. The invitation came from a respected journalist known for her probing interviews and commitment to social justice. It was an opportunity for Marcia to reach a broader audience, to share her vision with the public, and perhaps dispel some of the misconceptions surrounding her work. Marcia was hesitant at first. She knew that stepping into the public eye could be risky, that her words would be dissected and analyzed by both supporters and critics. But she also knew that this was a chance to show the community and her officers that her commitment to justice was unwavering. When the night of the interview arrived, Marcia dressed carefully, choosing a simple but professional outfit that conveyed both strength and humility. As she entered the studio, she felt a flutter of nerves, but she reminded herself of why she was there. She was here to tell the truth, to speak on behalf of those who had been silenced or ignored. The interview began with a few introductory questions about her background and her motivations for joining the police force. Marcia spoke candidly about her experiences growing up in a community where mistrust of the police was the norm, about the struggles she had faced as a Black woman in law enforcement, and about her commitment to bridging the gap between officers and the communities they served. Then the questions became more pointed. "Chief Wilson," the journalist began, her gaze steady and unyielding, "you've made headlines recently for your decision to suspend 2 officers who, some argue, were simply doing their jobs. Your critics say that you're undermining the department's morale, that you're creating a culture of fear. How do you respond to those accusations?" Marcia took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. I understand that change is difficult and that my approach may feel uncomfortable for some officers. But I believe that accountability is essential to our work. When officers act in ways that undermine public trust, it's my duty as chief to address that. Our job isn't just to enforce the law, it's to uphold justice, to protect and serve every member of our community with dignity and respect. If that means challenging long-standing practices, then I'm willing to do that. The journalist nodded thoughtfully, then pressed further. But do you worry about losing the support of your officers? About creating an environment where they feel hesitant to do their jobs? Marcia paused, considering her response. I believe that true support isn't blind loyalty. True support comes from a shared commitment to the values that define us as public servants. If officers feel hesitant to act because they're worried about being held accountable, then perhaps they need to rethink their approach to policing. I'm not here to punish good officers. I'm here to ensure that every officer, regardless of rank or tenure, is held to the same standard of integrity and respect. As the interview continued, Marcia spoke passionately about her vision for the department, about her belief in a future where police officers could be both protectors and partners to the communities they served. She spoke of Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman who had lost her grandson, and of the countless other residents who had come to her, seeking not just protection but understanding. When the interview ended, Marcia felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. She had laid her heart bare, exposing both her convictions and her vulnerabilities. She knew that her words would resonate with some and be dismissed by others, but she also knew that she had done her part. She had given the community and her officers a glimpse into the vision that drove her. The following day, Marcia arrived at the precinct to an unexpected sight. Several officers had gathered near the entrance, including Dyers, Donaldson, and a few others who had been vocal in their support of her reforms. They greeted her with nods and small smiles, their presence a silent show of solidarity. Lieutenant Donaldson stepped forward, offering a hesitant smile. "Chief, we watched your interview last night. I think a lot of us needed to hear that." Marcia nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I meant every word." He shifted, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I know I've been skeptical about some of the changes you've implemented, but I think I'm starting to understand what you're trying to accomplish, and I just wanted you to know that I respect that." Marcia's heart swelled with gratitude. This was a breakthrough she hadn't expected, and it filled her with a renewed sense of hope. She knew that Donaldson's support could be a turning point, a sign that others might also be willing to reconsider their positions. Over the next few weeks, Marcia noticed a shift in the atmosphere at the precinct. Officers who had once been resistant to her policies began to approach her with questions, seeking clarification on the community engagement initiatives, asking for advice on handling difficult situations. Slowly, the walls of hostility began to crumble, replaced by a cautious but growing respect. One afternoon, Marcia received an email from Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman who had attended the community forum months earlier. The message was brief, but it brought tears to Marcia's eyes. "Chief Wilson, I watched your interview. I wanted to thank you for everything you're doing, for standing up for people like my grandson. You're making a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like it. We need more people like you. Keep going. Don't let them stop you." Marcia read the email twice, feeling the weight of its words settle in her heart. She had come to this precinct to make a difference, to fight for a system that too often failed the very people it was supposed to protect. And now, for the first time, she felt like she was truly making progress. As she looked out her office window at the city she had vowed to protect, Marcia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. She knew that there would still be challenges, that the road ahead was long and filled with obstacles. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had allies, both within the precinct and in the community, who believed in her vision and were willing to fight alongside her. For Marcia Wilson, this was only the beginning. She was here to build a department that upheld justice, a department that saw every citizen as deserving of respect and dignity. And she knew that, With perseverance and unwavering resolve, she could transform not just the precinct, but the entire city. As the sun set over the skyline, casting a warm glow across the buildings, Marcia smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She was ready for whatever came next. She was here to stay, and she was ready to lead with strength, with empathy, and with a fierce commitment to justice.